So essentially in the United States, there's about 61 million people who are at risk of a lower limb complication. And there's a variety of reasons as to why traditional methods have failed.
What we saw when we were looking at this problem was a lot of these patients were being found too late. When a patient showed up for an amputation to a specialist, 60% of them, that was the first interaction they'd had with a specialist.
You're lucky if you're going to get them back in 3 months. Usually they're going to come back 7, 9, 8, 12 months later, in which case it becomes like a heck of a lot worse. So what's the traditional method and what's wrong with it?
Educating the patient and providing them these shoes can prevent this ulcer from forming. That ulcer took 30 plus weeks to heal. And if you look at the data, about $15,000 to $20,000 of kind of care. Patients are being at such a late stage that they end up in the hospital with this dramatic problem. And that's really the underlying reason why these amputations are so expensive.
Like, how does SFDI, how does it actually work?
You can't replace part of the brain.
You treat them the same.
Source of truth for the medtech industry.
Coexists with the prophets.
Robot understands things automatically.
Number one show in the medtech industry.
So Stryker got ahead of that and changed in the $90 billion company. They had help up high, a lot of things.
The state of medtech. Their host, Omar M. Khatib.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Today's guest is the CEO of Modulim, which I'll kind of introduce in a second. But one of the big things around the world is there are certain epidemics that happen that are so visceral, that are so visual, that everybody's aware of it, and it's a big problem. One of those things is a lower limb epidemic. So essentially in the United States, there's about 61 million people who are at risk of a lower limb complication, specifically getting their leg or limb amputated as a result of, let's say, diabetes, kidney disease, peripheral arterial disease, right? And there's a variety of reasons as to why traditional methods have failed, and Modulim is changing that in their approach. So joining us is my good friend and CEO, Amaan Mazhar. Amaan, it's so good seeing you. How are you doing?
Doing great, Omar. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. We've been wanting to do this for a while. So I know that it was tough, the coordination. So I'm glad it's finally happening. Before we dive into the company and the market and everything, maybe give us a little bit of background on yourself. What's your training? How did you get into medtech? And maybe we can segue that into Modulim.
Sure. So I'm a first generation immigrant. My parents moved here from the UK via the Middle East to get us into a good education. I ended up at Rice University with a degree in biomedical engineering and managerial studies. I think one of the things that was really great about that training was the campus was right across from the largest med center in the world. And so as an undergrad, I was able to do research literally by walking across the street and learn what research was all about. My advisor there introduced me to my advisor in grad school, where I got a PhD in biomedical engineering at UC Irvine at the Beckman Laser Institute. And that institute is sort of one of the world's leading institutes in biophotonics, the field of using light to assess tissue or treat tissue. And what our facility was super unique in the sense that the place where I sat, the lab, was literally next door to a dermatology clinic. And so I think that unique exposure of being able to build something and then go to a clinic and get clinical feedback really made me passionate about building tools for physicians and for patients. And so that technology that we developed, called spatial frequency domain imaging, it was done by a grad student who was a couple years ahead of me, David Kuchia, spun out into the company Modulated Imaging, now known as Modulim, and I've been working for the company ever since.
Amazing. And so to kind of sort of introduce the problem here, the thing that was shocking to me is that essentially foot ulcers, which is something you see commonly with diabetics. So 20% of those foot ulcers, they result in an amputation. That wasn't so shocking. The thing that shocked me on your website, which, by the way, if you're interested to see the technology and also see some of this data, you can go to modulim.com. That's spelled MODULIM.com. Is that the cost of a diabetic foot ulcer is greater than 5 most costly cancers. Can you explain that a little bit and expand on that?
That's right. When someone gets an ulcer, there's a lot of lost days at work. There's continuous treatment to manage those ulcers. Patients can go tens of weeks, if not full years, to be treated. And then eventually an ulcer leads to an amputation. And a single amputation is estimated to cost about $100,000 per event. And so, what we saw when we were looking at this problem was a lot of these patients were being found too late. One of our partners had said that when a patient showed up for an amputation to a specialist, 60% of them, that was the first interaction they'd had with a specialist. And so patients are being at such a late stage that they end up in the hospital with this dramatic problem. And that's really the underlying reason why these amputations are so expensive.
Got it. So, like, what's the current way that this problem is being solved? Which is you have to essentially screen these patients to make sure that they're not at risk for this. So, what's the traditional method, and what's wrong with it?
So, most healthcare organizations mandate a visual foot check on an annual basis to identify if there's a wound already in place for these patients. And so, a patient goes in, regardless of the specialist that they're seeing. The doctor will ask, how are their feet? Sometimes they will take off their shoes, sometimes they won't. And essentially, you're looking for the wound that already exists. There's some advanced associations or groups that will look at the underlying problem. The reason why these wounds are chronic is usually because there's a lack of circulation to the feet. So there are some non-invasive tests that can be applied to see if those patients are suffering from a lack of circulation due to underlying diabetes or peripheral arterial disease. But honestly, it's not done that often. And so the way that the current system is set up is to be reactive to a current wound. When you see it, then you treat it.
Got it. And the problem, as you know, it should be obvious to the audience, is that there's only so much that the human eye can see. And of course, like on top of that, you can add a lot of like variability in user judgment. You can have, let's say, a very skilled and well, seasoned physician, but maybe they're rushing, maybe it's the end of the day and they're tired. There's all kinds of issues with that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And that's sort of where we saw our value add. Essentially, what we have is a technology that has light that's shined onto the tissue and a camera that's able to capture the scene in a very objective manner. Not only do we capture what you would see visually with your eye, but we're also capturing the biomarkers of oxygenation and perfusion that are happening on the surface of the skin and about 10 times deeper than you can with your eye. And so not only are we enhancing the objectiveness of what we do, we're adding additional insights that can identify circulation issues that we've shown precede an actual wound from forming.
You've described in some of your talks that you have a $60 billion reactive care crisis that's tied to lower limb complications. So what specifically about Modulim's tech makes it the right wedge to essentially shift this market from reactive to proactive?
Right. So it's really our underlying biomarkers. We are able to assess the patient in a few minutes without adding any additional time to the standard appointment of a patient. So when a patient comes in to that primary care facility or an outpatient clinical facility, a medical assistant can basically take our camera and take an image of the bottom of the feet. Now, I say it's a few minutes. That's shoes off to shoes on. The actual image capture is seconds. And then we're able to create a 2D map of how much oxygen is on the surface of the skin and how much perfusion is in the skin. And our clinical data has shown that these biomarkers show local changes, whether it's a focal spot where the skin may be about to break down or sort of a global change because of upstream blockages in your leg with the larger vessels due to peripheral arterial disease, to identify those patients at higher risk. And so I stated earlier that oftentimes specialists are seeing patients at the later stage. By introducing this at the primary care or point of care, what we can do is get patients elevated to specialists at an earlier time. And so we've been working with healthcare systems that are thinking this way, or organizations that manage kind of a group of patients like diabetic or kidney disease patients, and they're interested in preventing hospitalizations due to these complications.
Yeah, and just an example for those who are watching on YouTube or Spotify, like one of the things that really struck me is like from your LSI presentation this year is this image about how macrovascular insights, they give you a much better view. So on the left, we have like a foot that seems perfectly fine there. It doesn't seem to be any visible issues. But when you use what you're calling subsurface microvascular biomarkers, it shows that the large majority of this foot is not being perfused well. And 13 weeks later, you end up with a really bad foot ulcer. And just for context, 13 weeks, we're talking about what, barely 3 months. And
Right.
so a lot of times in our healthcare system, you know, a patient comes in to see you, you're lucky if you're going to get them back in 3 months. Usually they're going to come back 7, 9, 8, 12 months later, in which case it becomes like a heck of a lot worse,
That's
And
right.
so I think that's where that cost of like treating these things has become so astronomical, right?
That's right, Omar. And just to point out in that particular patient, there's a focal spot where the ulcer formed 13 weeks later. And when we showed this to our podiatry colleagues, the simple solution to prevent that from happening is a $100 pair of shoes that basically offloads the pressure where that skin is starting to break down. And so educating the patient and providing them these shoes can prevent this ulcer from forming. That ulcer took 30 plus weeks to heal. And if you look at the data, about $15,000 to $20,000 of kind of care.
Mm-hmm. And just sort of digging more into that on the technology side. So you described like this way of imaging as spatial frequency domain imaging, and I believe you had that cleared with the FDA. So how does that ability to detect that microvascular dysfunction, let's say before visual symptoms appear, how do you think that could possibly like reshape how payers or even health systems start thinking about risk?
Yeah, so when we've looked at and talked to our key opinion leaders, everybody kind of knows that microvascular disease and macrovascular disease. So macro is like the larger vessels to the leg. Microvasculature is basically the smaller capillaries where oxygen exchange happens, are known risk factors for ulcers. So if you have both of those disease states, you're 22 times more likely to end up with an amputation. And so our technology, SFDI, spatial frequency domain imaging, is able to characterize tissue both from its functional and structural components. So I think we've all held up a flashlight to our thumb and we see red light come through. What's happening when you shine light onto the tissue is you're actually looking at the functional status of hemoglobin and how oxygenated it is in the tissue itself. We're also able to look at the skin integrity with our what's called the scattering signal. And so by doing this kind of unique illumination and capture scheme, we create a 2D map of what's happening about 3 to 4 millimeters deep in the skin with both the functional status of the tissue, the oxygenation and the deoxygenation, and also the structural part of the tissue in terms of the tissue scattering and how close it is to breaking down.
Got it. The other thing that really caught my attention about the technologies is the pace that you guys moved in terms of innovation, which you don't really see as often in our space. So more specifically is that you guys went from a cart-based system, where you actually had a cart as a piece of capital equipment. And I think within a year and a half, you moved to a handheld imaging device. So like, can you talk, like, first of all, how did something like that happen, and what kind of technical breakthroughs essentially enabled that shift? Because I think that's a really big testament to your team, but also the ability to apply like new technologies to your product and make it better.
Thanks, Omar. Yeah, so we got an FDA cleared cart system and launched it in 2020. We got a ton of great clinical data from that system and continue to support that out in the field today. But we quickly learned by being out in the market that the real pull was to have a handheld device. And the reason was our partners wanted to go out into the community and assess patients. And a handheld form factor, which was always part of our roadmap, was sort of the request from all of our customers. And so essentially in 2023, we focused the company with a pivot to focus on developing that handheld system. There's a combination of things that allowed that to happen. Innovations in lighting and LED, innovations in cameras and sensors that we were able to adopt, some algorithm approaches using machine learning and machine vision to simplify how we acquire data. All that pieced together with a pretty talented technology team was able to take what was a cart-based system, about 5'10" tall, into a handheld system that's less than 3 pounds, that we're anticipating getting into the FDA this year and release next year. So we're really excited about the launch of that system. I'm also excited to share that we'll be doing our first clinical study in a pilot IRB setting with it, and it'll basically be the equivalent to our cart system.
That's amazing. And again, like Being a startup, you guys are focused mainly on like the development and technology and everything. So I know that you guys haven't had a chance to update the website yet, but I just want to show this just for maybe the investors who are watching, just to see like how impressive this is. So like this is the old technology, right? And
Right.
so as you can see, like it is essentially a cart that it can be wheeled around in an office, right? But there's a screen, there's the imaging device, right? So essentially, you took it from this entire cart, right, to what you show in your presentation is this like one little handheld device where it looks like it's the size of those what's it called? Those payment systems that you see in a restaurant when the waiter comes up to your. It looks actually smaller than that. How big is it roughly?
Yeah, it's slightly larger than like a large cell phone, and easily held in one hand. And essentially, you can capture the data in rapid succession on that device.
That's amazing. And so, what did that do just in terms of like your manufacturing costs and cogs and everything, going from the cart down to that handheld device?
It simplifies the manufacturing. It reduces the cogs, but more importantly, it allows us to touch more of the patients upstream, where we think we can have the biggest impact in solving this problem. So you can imagine in primary care, real estate is incredibly important. Patient numbers that come through are lower than you would see in a specialist, and time in form factor is critical. And so what this does is it opens up that larger market where most of these patients need to be identified and are currently being missed.
So, and I think the important side of it is that your ability to scale a very specific skill set through primary care, which again, something like this can sit in every single primary care physician's office, and then more importantly, capture these issues ahead of time and serve as a referral, like essentially a referral pathway to, let's say, a podiatrist right away. Is that correct? Is that the way to look at it?
That's right, a podiatrist or a vascular specialist. So what we've found is we have some unique signatures that can help identify whether the issue is micro or macro. And it's up to the physician to decide what to do based off of our biomarkers. But we ran a pilot in a dialysis center, for example, and we were able to identify patients that had an existing wound and document it, also patients who didn't have a wound and had some circulation issues, and create sort of a patient workflow that worked for that local region to get proactive care to these patients.
That's amazing. Now, talking about that, so again, you're through the FDA. You're currently going through on the handheld side, but you with Clarify the cart, you got through the FDA. You're pre-commercial, but you do have some traction on the commercial side, I believe. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, we were able to collect a lot of incredibly valuable data, 4,000 plus patients, to sort of understand the clinical value of the data that we were having. And so we were able to, for example, one of the studies we did with the University of Arizona, it's known that the current non-invasive vascular testing tests do very poorly in diabetes patients, sensitivity as low as 50%. That's a coin flip. And so we were able to identify that our microvascular signatures were more sensitive than what you can do with current non-invasive testing. So that's important clinical data to get sort of buy-in on this technology. I think the second piece that we've had a lot of success with is working with organizations that are managing patients from beginning to end. So two partners that we've had and we've published with, one is Kaiser Permanente. They manage the patient from primary care to any sort of complication. And so we were able to go into kind of outpatient settings, assess these patients and look at our data and compare them to ulcer incidence, and also compare them to their current methods of risk categorization and show that, our objective method could be integrated into a standard appointment without adding additional time and actually correctly kind of, or better improve how you're risk stratifying the patient. So what came out of that was the value of the clinical data, but also what came out of that was the need for this handheld system. And so that's why we put our heads down to work on this particular problem. The other partner we've had is Fresenius Medical Care. They manage their partner, yeah.
And I was thinking that's a good partner because they have a huge footprint in the United States, well, worldwide, especially in the United States.
That's right. And so they manage these high risk dialysis patients, so high risk kidney disease. And essentially they have a monthly foot check in place to manage those, to identify these issues. And they're concerned about hospitalization rates because they're getting into more kind of total cost of care contracts with these patients. And so we went into a dialysis clinic when patients were getting their normal dialysis done and assessed their foot risk and created a program, again, without changing any of the workflows currently, to identify those patients at risk.
That's amazing. And just talking more on the commercial side, so you have a commercial model that really leans on embedded hardware and a recurring subscriptions. Can you sort of expand on, like, why did you choose that route, and then how does it support sort of long-term adoption versus, let's say, traditional device sales?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you're sort of helping on the preventive side, there's a shared partnership in growing the financial benefits for all of our partners, right? And so we felt like getting a device placed and then having software available to view the data and annotate it was the most powerful way to get started with these partners. I think the second component of it is just like what's been happening with a lot of imaging technologies, is all of our data is actually quantitative. And so not only do you see those color maps that you showed earlier on the map, there's numbers affiliated with each of those biomarkers and locations that you point. And so we see in our product roadmap the ability to augment that with AI and be able to identify different disease states or different workflows depending on the organization. And those are additional software modules that we can add into our product to make them the most useful for the customer depending on how they're using it. And
just to, wave the regulatory magic wand, like, you're not making any claims here. We're just talking about aspirations and stuff. But like when you talk about like identifying other diseases and everything, would this be essentially doing the same like perfusion imaging just on the foot, or are you talking about other places?
So our regulatory indication is to measure any tissue with potential circulatory compromise.
Time out. Any tissue?
That's correct.
Okay.
So, when you look at the historical context of people have been using oxygenation measures, people have used them in tissue transfer flaps to identify whether a flap is successful or not. People have used them in all kinds of different wounds. People have used them even as far as looking at just general skin conditions. And so, we're focused on the lower limb market because that's where we saw the biggest unmet need and most compelling clinical data. But certainly we support partnerships in other areas as well. Okay.
So let's play a game of imagination here for the investors who are listening and stuff. But as an example, and let me hold on. Let me just pull up the stat on this, because as you're saying this, that's what kind of got me to think about this. Okay. So many years ago, so back in 2017, almost a decade ago, Stryker acquired a company called Novadac, which uses fluorescent to look at tissue perfusion and everything. They acquired them for $654 million. And then eventually, I think it was licensed to, and I think Intuitive then acquired that. And so that was like a really big thing, because for Intuitive, they essentially use this non-radioactive fluorescent dye, which is green, to enhance the visualization of blood flow and tissue perfusion during surgery.
That's right.
Is it possible to somehow license and extend this technology into robotics when assessing the perfusion of certain diseased organs?
Yes, I mean, and we've done some work kind of in the flap space when I was a grad student in the early days of the company, where our contrast is very complementary to what can be done with fluorescence. Not only do we measure the perfusion, but we measure the oxygenation or the metabolic activity in a wide field manner. And so it certainly can be added to that. SFDI itself, again, sort of my background, can be combined with fluorescence as well to help enhance contrast and also be more quantitative with the fluorescence signals coming back.
So just to kind of talk like a little bit more tech, like how does SFDI, like how does it actually work?
Yeah. So essentially what we're doing is we shine pattern light. So if you look on our website, there's lines of light that we shine onto the tissue, and the tissue blurs it. And the reason why those patterns are blurred is because it's telling you about the structural component of the tissue. That's the unique part of SFDI. Then what we layer on top of that is something called multispectral or hyperspectral imaging, where we use multiple colors of light, both visible and near infrared, to look at the functional parameter of the tissue, which is the hemoglobin, how much oxygen is attached to the hemoglobin, and how deoxygenated it is. And so
that's all just based on the refraction that light the tissue's causing through the light.
That's right. That's right. So we're looking at the sort of the input. We know the input very well. We measure the output. And then our expertise coming from the Beckman Laser Institute is modeling light propagation through tissue. So we're able to do a model of how the light interacts with the tissue and come up with these quantitative biomarkers through our unique models. And so that's why we really are very passionate about how these biomarkers not only give you visual insight about what's happening under the skin, but it's really powerful, unique data that can be used to train any sort of use case afterwards with the right type of clinical study to look at it.
Wow, interesting. And why? I mean, why? The answer is always obvious to me, but I think it's good for the audience here. But like, why hasn't one of the largest strategics with the money and resources, like, how come nobody's thought of going this route? Is it just because of the timing in terms of what technologies were available the last few years, or why hasn't this been applied? Why was Modulim the first to kind of think about this?
Well, I think that, first of all, SFDI was sort of invented out of our lab, and we certainly partnered. Multispectral imaging itself has been used through multiple flavors.
So this is kind of unique, so that because usually certain technological applications, they'll come out of a lab from many years ago, and then people had to. So this is one of the rare cases where this actual technique came out of your actual lab. It's
Correct.
Not like you found. Okay, so it's because there's other there's a lot of great medical devices and tech out there that took an application from a certain industry and said, hey, this XYZ technology has existed forever. Let's apply it in med device, and they have a blockbuster application. This actually came out of your lab.
That's correct. Yeah, we were sort of solving. David was solving one of the issues in terms of imaging, actually a fluorescence biomarker when he was a grad student, and wanting to do it over a wide area. And so that came out as a new technique and method now that a number of academic groups practice to do research.
Amazing. And so, how robust is your IP mode right now then?
So we have IP that was originally from UC Irvine that we have an exclusive license to, so a great partnership with them. And then on top of that, we've layered on our own IP to put things into practice, and also done some application-based IP as well. It's a really great partnership with the UC system. I think one of the things that, again, that was so beneficial in my career development was UC Irvine had a great, not only clinical engineering partnership, but a great tech transfer partnership as well.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. So like currently, I know you guys are like every startup raising, but at the moment, like what's kind of on your roadmap for the rest of your year in terms of regulatory pathway, commercial plans, etc.?
Yeah, so we're focused on getting this handheld through into the FDA. It's going to be a 510K using our own device as a predicate. And then one of the partnerships I haven't mentioned yet is this technology also got a lot of interest from the military. So the military has a very similar need in the sense that they need to be able to assess soldiers at the point of care, because they're thinking about more far forward battle scenarios where soldiers may be injured, they have a burn wound, and there's a very subjective way to assess them right now. Essentially the expert's visual check, which can be wrong a third of the time. And so experts aren't available in a far forward scenario, and they put out a call to help develop a burn digital assessment tool. And we were fortunate enough to apply and get that contract to kind of customize this handheld version into a military version to do essentially the same thing where you're assessing a patient at the point of care.
That's amazing. And for the remainder of the year, I'm wondering, are there any specific like conferences that you guys are going to be attending, whether it's medical conferences or investor summits, that people can meet you guys up at?
Yeah, we'll be at the epidemic conference down in San Diego. We'll be at LSI in the spring again, but I'm also reachable as needed through email or whatever, LinkedIn, whatever means necessary.
Awesome. And last question for you is that one of the things that you had talked about is that you sort of validated that clinical risk is being underestimated in nearly half of the diabetic of some diabetic populations. What role do you think Modulim can help when it comes to like bridging that gap, which is really a data gap, and how big is that opportunity? Just let's say here in the United States.
You mean in terms of how many patients aren't being assessed?
Yes.
I mean, our estimate is anywhere between 30 to 40 million people could benefit from an annual assessment. And so, when you look at the mortality rates of diabetic foot ulcers, they're in the order of magnitude of 30% when you get an ulcer, 5-year mortality rates, and 57% when you have an amputation. And so, I think of an analogy back to the cancer analogy you made earlier. Breast cancer, when you're late stage, is higher than any of those two numbers, but early stage, the mortality rates are around 9%. And that's because we've introduced advanced screening and testing for people that we know are at risk. And so what's missing in this space is a point of care tool to assess patients' risk so that you can implement very simple multidisciplinary care, both through coaching or kind of procedural events, which have been shown to reduce complications up to 56%. And so that's the opportunity for us, empowering healthcare teams with this point of care imaging so they can better manage their patients between all the specialties that want to talk together under a digital roof.
Fantastic. I'm personally really excited about you guys, especially considering some of the early traction you've gotten, the ability to pivot and adapt to the market, which a lot of times you don't see companies doing that to the form factor because it can delay things a lot longer. But you guys were able to pivot from a cart to a handheld device in a year. So I'm really excited for you and the team. For those who are listening, if you know somebody who's in primary care in the vascular space, please forward this episode on to them. You can learn more by going to the website. That's modulim.com. That's MODULIM.com. And of course, if you know investors who are interested in the space, forward it on to them. I'm your host, Omar Khatib. As always, give us 5 stars, subscribe to the show, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks for checking out this episode. If you want to do me a big favor and join so many other people who have helped grow this podcast, take a second and look below. If you're on Apple, give us 5 stars and write a short review. If you're on Spotify, just give us 5 stars. And if you're on YouTube, hit the like button. And most importantly, if you can, subscribe. We release so many different episodes that you may miss. Be sure to subscribe and turn your notifications on. You get extra points with me if you subscribe across all 3 channels. Thank you so much. And if you felt like this episode helped you, send this to somebody who'd really enjoy and appreciate it. Share and spread the love. We'll see you all next time.